U.S. Marine Corps Base Quantico in the state of Virginia. It's a center of military strategy. In an underground storage area deep within the base, records of one of the deadliest battles in U.S. history sat unnoticed for 70 years.
This is a film on Peleliu.
They consist of 113 rolls of film from the Battle of Peleliu, a Pacific island and a site of fierce combat during World War II. U.S. forces deployed a highly destructive weapon for the first time on an actual battlefield. U.S. Marines fell to bullets fired by the Japanese. Japanese soldiers, even those who had lost their will to fight, also faced relentless attacks. Men became delirious, unable to cope with the brutality of the battle. The footage was taken by 18 Marine Corps cameramen. They were dispatched to record the bravery of U.S. forces and make propaganda films. Our research led us to the only surviving cameraman.
Oh.
Grant Wolfkill is 91 years old. This was the first time he'd seen any of the footage he shot.
It's quite amazing. Where did you get this? I think luck is such an important part of living through combat. But I would like to discuss it with them, and I'm not sure one word would cover it. Frantic, bloodier, more Cooker-like situation than on Peleliu.
He called Peleliu a battlefield of madness. It's a small island surrounded by coral reefs with a circumference of only about 26 kilometers. In 1944, Japanese and U.S. forces engaged in a deadly battle over this island. The Marines suffered the U.S. military's highest ever percentage of casualties. Some 10,000 Japanese soldiers were sent to Peleliu, but only 34 managed to fight to the end and survive. The battle was so fierce and casualties so high that survivors have been reluctant to talk about it. Kiyokazu Tsuchida, 94, is one of the survivors. He visited the tomb commemorating the leader of the Japanese garrison in which he fought. Army Colonel Kunio Nakagawa killed himself at the end of the battle. His remains are still on Peleliu.
It was such a fierce battle. It was like sealing up two scorpions in a jar and letting them fight till one is dead. It was either kill or be killed. There was nowhere to escape to.
What happened on Peleliu Island? What did the American and Japanese troops witness there? We'll uncover the truth about the bloody battlefield for the first time through newly discovered film and eyewitness accounts. Peleliu is about 3,200 kilometers south of Japan. It's one of the Palau Islands in the western Pacific. It features a 1,600-meter runway. Japanese forces built the airfield just before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. It was considered the best in Asia at the time. Some 300 aircraft were deployed there. In April 1944, the Army sent Colonel Kunio Nakagawa and his 2nd Infantry Regiment to Peleliu to defend the island. At the time, the Japanese were in a dire situation. They were said to be the most capable fighters in the Japanese Imperial Army. Keiji Nagai, now 93, was an Army sergeant. He says he was ready to die when he arrived on Peleliu.
Our orders were to defend the island no matter what, to guard the place, even if it meant death. So, we waited for the enemy to arrive.
That year, Japan lost part of New Guinea, Saipan, and other islands in its so-called Absolute National Defense Zone to the U.S. Meanwhile, U.S. forces had set their sights on a stronghold of Japan's southern operations, Leyte Island in the Philippines. U.S. military leaders saw strategic value in the airfield on Peleliu. From there, attack aircraft would be able to reach Leyte easily. Japanese forces had learned of this plan and sent Nakagawa's elite unit to spearhead the island's defense. Five months later, U.S. troops headed to the island to capture it. About 17,000 members of the 1st Marine Division were at the heart of the campaign. They were among the Marine Corps' best-trained troops. Major General William Rupertus led the division. He boasted that he and his men could seize Peleliu Island in just 3 days.
Hi, hello. How are you?
Former Corporal R.V. Bergen fought in the 1st Marine Division. He's 92 years old. He recalls that he and his fellow Marines were rather optimistic before they landed.
We'd be there 2-3 days at most. That's what we were told. Just because it was a small island, I think, is what they were based on. We were mentally and physically ready to go.
That's the one. Absolutely.
Grant Wolfgill was a combat cameraman in the 1st Marine Division. Peleliu was the first battleground he filmed.
Because I ended up putting tape around them all.
He was under special orders to record the courageous actions of U.S. Marines.
They wanted to show how troops move forward, how wounded are evacuated, how the tanks fared, how they dug in the artillery, how they blew up caves. Anything that was action was what they wanted.
On September 15th, U.S. troops launched their operation to capture Peleliu. They headed for the west side of the island, near the airfield. This footage was taken by a cameraman crouching in the bow of a landing craft. The elite troops of Japan and the U.S. were on the brink of their first encounter. First to come ashore were some 3,000 members of the 1st Marine Regiment. They were considered the best in the division. John Lom was a private. He remembers moving forward in the face of the Japanese onslaught.
The Japanese were very active with their mortars and artillery, and the Amtrak that I was in, we got splashed several times with water coming over from the explosion, and it's close, but we did make it to the beach.
Japanese gunfire destroyed many American vessels and vehicles. Wolfkill took this footage right after he landed.
I'm sure I did, but your first contact with the enemy, even dead or wounded, is almost a shock.
The U.S. troops then prepared for a Japanese attack they called the Banzai Charge. It was a Japanese maneuver in which an entire unit, bayonets and swords drawn, would attack an enemy position. U.S. forces had defeated such efforts with their overwhelming firepower. They figured they would easily crush the Banzai Charge and end the Battle of Peleliu in 3 days. Corporal Bergen had his weapon ready to bring about a swift conclusion.
You might catnap, but everybody was tense and was expecting a Banzai Charge, which we never had.
It was different than all previous fighting because the Japanese used a different tactic. They didn't rush out to get killed.
Why didn't the Japanese troops launch a Banzai Charge? A month earlier, Japan's army had made a big change in strategy. After a devastating defeat on Saipan, officials issued a telegram concerning the defense of Japanese-controlled islands.
Hold out as long as possible and inflict massive damage on the enemy. Do not rush and attempt major counterattacks in haste.
Suicidal maneuvers like Banzai Charges were banned. The Battle of Peleliu was the first to be based on the new directives. It marked a big shift in how Japanese and U.S. forces fought each other. Colonel Nakagawa had received the instructions and was preparing for a protracted battle. He ordered his men to dig through hard layers of coral limestone and create a complex network of tunnels and trenches. Some were big enough to hide more than 1,000 fighters. The Japanese created more than 500 of these underground positions, mainly in steep rocky hills north of the airfield. They turned the entire central part of the island into a fortress. Eight hours after landing on Peleliu, the U.S. troops proceeded with their most important mission, capturing the airfield. Melvin Simons was a private. He suddenly encountered a Japanese tank unit.
They threw everything they had at us. They threw 24 tanks at us. We still had planes in the air. We had the power.
Kiyokazu Tsuchida was defending the airfield. He saw Japanese tanks struggling against enemy tanks that were nearly twice as big.
The Americans had 75mm guns on their Sherman tanks. Ours were 37mm. We could hit their tanks but couldn't penetrate their armor. Their guns could destroy one of our tanks with a single shot. Then their tanks would run over and kill 5 or 6 of us, just like that.
Keiji Nagai, the army sergeant, followed the tank unit to attack the enemy.
Japanese soldiers were dying everywhere. All I could do was look after a fellow soldier next to me. Some of the injured had legs or arms blown away. There were bodies without heads. Some people were moaning in pain, begging to be killed.
This is footage of Japanese tanks destroyed during the battle. The tank unit was key to defending the airfield, but it was annihilated on the first day. The U.S. troops kept advancing and were taking control of the airfield. But they became targets for Japanese soldiers firing from their positions in the hills.
The artillery was falling and a sniper fire was coming in. That was the longest walk I ever had in my life, I'll tell you that. You could hear the bullets whistling by your head and ricocheting off of the ground or the trees, and you'd see dead Marines that they had killed or wounded Marines that they had killed.
On the third day after the landing, the U.S. troops captured Japanese positions near the airfield. They also seized rice and other supplies. During 3 days of fighting, at least 2,400 Japanese died. The U.S. side also suffered over 2,000 casualties. The U.S. forecast of swift victory turned out to be overly optimistic. At this point, they had managed to capture only 1/3 of the island. Sterling Mace was a private. A conversation with a friend still resonates in his memory.
He says to me, "Mace, you think we'll be out of here in 3 days?" So innocent, you know, because I was going, yeah, Dennis, at the third day they come over the hill there and everybody's happy. I said, I don't think so. I told him. He had ulcerated feet underneath his feet. He walked like he was 100 years old.
Boats headed to an offshore hospital ship were filled with the injured. Major General Rupertus had received suggestions that he request the Army's help. But he rejected the idea, saying he and his Marines could capture the entire island on their own in another 2 days. He saw the Army as a rival. He wanted sole credit for the victory. The Marines were drawn into combat in the steep rocky hills where the Japanese troops had spread their fortress of tunnels and trenches. All the fighters in the Japanese garrison were given strict instructions to wipe out the enemy. If Americans are long spears, we're short daggers. In other words, the Japanese military leadership believed that close combat would be the only way to beat the Americans with their superior firepower. Making their way toward the hills where the Japanese were waiting, the Americans were headed into the trap the Japanese had set.
They would, if you was marching, like through the jungle, if you was marching in a single file, the Japanese would fall in behind you and cut the last man in the column. He would cut his throat or stab him in the heart, and then he would go to the next one and do that.
The Japanese conducted guerrilla warfare from their tunnel positions. The number of casualties quickly mounted. What the U.S. side feared most was getting shot by Japanese snipers hiding in their tunnels.
It was hot, so the Americans would open the hatches of their tanks and drink some water. Then we'd shoot them, and they'd drop like this.
The U.S. soldiers never knew where the bullets would come from. They were constantly on edge.
Where were these guys running into? You couldn't tell. Everything looked like you couldn't see a hole, a cave, you couldn't see anything.
They had that whole island so registered, they had the coordinates for everything they needed to know. So that's why it wasn't good to sit still.
This footage shows Americans who had been shot by Japanese snipers. The man in the center is a wounded soldier. 2 others came to his rescue with a stretcher, but they were also shot and left unable to move. Others arrived to help them. They finally managed to reach their tank. With the risk of death all around them, they were quickly overcome by combat fatigue. The Japanese campaign against the exhausted Americans continued around the clock. The horror of those days still haunts Melvin Simons.
There were a bunch of men out there, and they've been up, and sometimes they don't intend to, but they fall off asleep. Well, they fell off asleep, and they was next to me, which is about maybe 8 feet. They got in the foxhole with them, and they fought it out there. You know, well, they killed one guy and then wounded the other one. They'd retreat, and then they'd set up, you know, to fight you, and you do get scared.
As the Japanese troops lurked into underground bunkers, the U.S. fighters tried to attack from above. They could almost hear each other breathe.
Someone said, "Hey, Suchida, I hear enemy voices." "Oh, I can hear them." I heard rustling, which was gradually growing louder. I stood up and looked, wondering what was going on, only to find an American looking at me. He appeared to be wondering what was going on too. We were both unarmed. We just stumbled on each other, only a foot apart. He was a heavily sunburned white guy. We looked at each other, saying nothing. We both stepped back, away from each other. I found Americans, 5 or 6 of them. I told the guy next to me, and I said, "Run!" And we all ran. That's how we survived.
Trapped on a small island with no hope of escape, the Japanese and American forces engaged in close combat. They weren't even sure where their front lines were. Grant Wolfkill filmed this footage around that time. He'd been instructed to film acts of courage, but dead bodies had become one of his most frequent subjects.
I rarely shot American dead. It bothered me and I didn't see where it served a purpose. But as I said, as time goes on, everyone becomes more callous. But once they're dead, they're pretty much, as they used to be referred to, as logs. Didn't make it acceptable in the Marine Corps, but nobody thought about it.
The 3,000 officers and men of the 1st Regiment were said to be the cream of the Marine Corps. 1 week into the invasion, the regiment's casualty rates reached nearly 60%, the worst since the founding of the Corps. Private John Lom survived. 20 comrades from his 44-member platoon died.
We weren't a fighting team anymore. I can't progress through the battle as it progressed. I just can't do that. I'll jump back and forth. It was just the most unpleasant situation you could possibly think of.
Fighting on the front line, the elite regiment was forced to withdraw just 1 week after the invasion. In the meantime, the situation in the area surrounding the island had taken a dramatic turn. U.S. Army General Douglas MacArthur decided to proceed with the invasion of Leyte with 60,000 soldiers even before the fall of Peleliu. Peleliu's strategic value was fading. Two weeks into the invasion, and with nearly 5,000 service members dead or wounded, the U.S. forces finally debuted their latest lethal weapon. The armored vehicle was equipped with a flamethrower. with a range of 130 meters. It made it possible to burn Japanese fighters to death without approaching their hideouts.
The flamethrower had a reach of about 100 meters. We were attacked every day in our bunkers. Friends I chatted with one day would be charred beyond recognition the next.
On top of that, U.S. aircraft dropped napalm bombs, incinerating the rocky bunker-strewn hills in 1,000 degrees Celsius heat. The deployment of the new weapon pushed the Japanese death toll past 9,000. The survivors had no other choice but to remain in their bunkers. They'd run out of food and drinking water. Surrender was forbidden. So were suicide charges. The battle had dragged on for more than a month.
Every day is hard in a protracted battle. There's no way you can last for 2 months or even one. On a battlefield where you could be killed at any time, day or night, you're in constant fear of death. That would drive any normal person mad.
A survivor saw a fellow soldier take his own life in despair. Chosei Kameya was in the Japanese Navy.
He screamed, "Long live the Emperor!" Shot himself in the head with a pistol. Shot himself in his own damn head. So he died instantly.
Even in October, the mercury stayed above 40 degrees Celsius in Peleliu. The small island was blanketed with an overpowering stench from the heaps of corpses left to rot.
To sit by a dead body that's been there for a couple of days and is bloated up about twice his size, and the stench and the flies are swarming him. I mean, those old big green blowflies.
A Japanese lies on the ground dead. Nearby, Americans sit staring vacantly. With no clear sense of purpose, both sides continued their campaign of death. On the 8th of November, 50 days into the battle, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, the commander of the Japanese garrison, had seen his forces reduced to just over 300 men. On this day, Nakagawa sent an urgent telegram to a regional commander on Palau.
We've endured severe hardship for weeks. I'm determined to stage an all-out, hand-to-hand attack on the airfield.
Nakagawa had run out of munitions. He proposed a bonsai attack using only handheld bayonets. The reply came promptly.
Inspire the fighting spirit of 100 million Japanese souls and stick with the current mission until the end.
Nakagawa was ordered to carry on with the protracted battle to boost public morale. The U.S. didn't alter its original course either. On October 20th, General MacArthur finally landed on Leyte. At this point, Peleliu lost any strategic value it might once have had in the Leyte invasion. Peleliu was thus eliminated from the main theater of war. Still, the military brass insisted on capturing the island. Troops were waging a hopeless battle with no end in sight. After a month or so, the battle became a deranged, inhuman killing game. Bergen says he saw some of his peers become victims of extreme cruelty.
They had 3 Marines tied up to a tree, 3 different trees. And they had used them for bayonet practice. And they had cut their testicles out and their penis stuck in their mouth. And that just made you want to kill them all that much more, that much more. They used, like I said, they used them for bayonet practice, and I bet there was 50 bayonet stabs in all 3 of them, each, 50. We messed around there for, I don't know how long it was. Sledge had said to me, he said, "Bergen, there's Japs in that." I eased up beside the bunker and I peeped over there, and there's a Jap in there with his face up in that vent. And I just took my rifle and stuck it right in his face and pulled the trigger. Then I stuck my rifle down in there and just moved it around, the best I could, and emptied eight shells, fired 8 times in there. And it was just like kicking a beehive. I didn't know how many was in there, but I knew there was a bunch. 10 inside and 7 outside, but there were 17. I do remember that, there were 17.
Driven by a chain reaction of hatred, Peleliu had become a battlefield of madness. The films are filled with scenes of mayhem. This is footage of a U.S. Marine patrol boat. A Japanese soldier had apparently lost his will to fight. He was shot without mercy. Marines searched the body before dumping it back in the water. Men succumbed to the spiraling madness and suffered unbearable emotional pain once they returned to their senses. An American sits with his head in his hands. This photo was taken shortly after he killed a Japanese in close combat. He later had this to say about the situation.
In the middle of combat on the rocky hill, a Japanese soldier came right at me, and he's got this bayonet, and I shot him twice in the stomach. I saw a photo sticking out of the dead soldier's uniform. I took it out and looked at it. It was a family photo of him with his parents and little sister. Oh my God, what have I done? I was deeply shocked and at a loss for words.
The former Marine said he just kept his head down, his face in his hands. He couldn't move for a long time. Many men completely lost touch with reality. The newly discovered films include vivid footage of an apparently deranged Marine. In the frenzy of battle, people even killed their comrades.
And then he got louder and louder and louder. And they're going to kill me, they're going to kill me, you know, and all that kind of good stuff. And we, the corpsman gave him enough morphine to kill a horse, and it didn't have any effect on him. And he just kept getting louder and louder and louder, and the Japs were within 400 or 500 yards of us, I know. So one of the guys hit him in the head with a entrenching shovel and killed him. It killed him. But I've never had any regrets about that. We sacrificed one man. I could have sacrificed the whole patrol.
Some footage hints at executions within Japanese ranks. These men were decapitated. Their hands and feet were bound. At that time, Japanese who deserted or surrendered were subject to summary execution.
There was no tolerance for deserters. On the battlefield, humans were considered no better than animals. Otherwise, you couldn't kill them. And if you didn't, you would be killed.
By November 24th, day 71 of the battle, U.S. forces had captured all of the Japanese positions except the garrison's headquarters. Of the 120 Japanese who were still alive, 70 were wounded so badly they couldn't move. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa had led the Japanese forces through the protracted battle. The situation has become so tense, I'm finding it difficult to maintain our positions. After sending this message, Nakagawa killed himself. Then, with a U.S. cleanup operation on the remaining Japanese troops, the Battle of Peleliu came to an end on its 74th day. On Peleliu, Japan had waged its first ever battle of attrition, and the U.S. forces were the first to face this new strategy. The result was a protracted, open-ended killing spree. That led to the battles of Iwo Jima and then Okinawa, where many civilians lost their lives in random acts of killing. John Dower is a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian. For many years, he has studied the struggle between Japan and the U.S. during the war. He views Peleliu as a unique battle.
This is where they begin to see the Japanese plans to do a ferocious last-ditch defense. And it's one of the worst battles that they have encountered up to that point. It'll get worse. Iwo Jima, Okinawa will be even more ferocious. At Peleliu, they really used napalm to drive the Japanese forces out of the caves. And of course, then they use napalm in Iwo Jima, in Okinawa, and then they use it in the bombing of Japan. So Peleliu is a horror story in many, many ways.
"70 years after the Battle of Peleliu. Ruins of Japanese bunkers are still being found. So are old Japanese weapons. The remains of more than 2,500 Japanese officers and men are still on the island. Survivors of the insane battle. They have kept the memories of that hellish time to themselves. Even after 70 years, the nightmare hasn't receded.
Bothers me a lot. I mean, even this morning, any morning it happens, everything stops.
Once they began, the cruel atrocities escalated and spun out of control. The Battle of Peleliu is a powerful reminder of what war really is.